Welcome to the Reflections Podcast, where we reflect on the writings of the fathers of the faith. We have two questions going into all of these discussions. First, did we get it right? As in, are we accurately representing the theologian we are hoping to summarize for you? And then second, do you agree with this theologian? What do you think? Some of them you'll disagree, some of them you'll agree. This first episode is meant to kind of set the stage for all of the future discussions and is kind of bonus episode where we'll be discussing church history. We are using Williston Walker's 1918 book, A History of the Christian Church. He writes, in this history, the writer has endeavored to treat the vast field of the story of the church so as to make evident, as far as he is able, the circumstances of its origin, its early development, the changes which led to the Reformation, as well as the course of that tremendous upheaval, and those influences which have resulted in the present situation and tendencies of the life of the church. As far as space would permit, he has directed attention to the growth of doctrine and the modification of Christian thought. He breaks history into 7 periods, but obviously his history ends over 100 years ago, since he wrote it in 1918 and here we are in 2025. So the past 100 plus years will be absent from this discussion because it's absent from his book. Walker was a Presbyterian and a professor at Hartford and Yale. Now, in addition to his book, I also recommend Justo Gonzalez's The Story of Christianity. It's in 2 volumes, as well as Shelley and Shelley's Church History in Plain Language. Both are available as audiobooks and ebooks, and you can find them in an affiliated link below this video in the description box below. Here we go.
This time, we're taking a look at early Christianity.
We're going to be using this historical text as our guide and
it could be great.
Really trying to understand how Christianity evolved.
It's such a fascinating story. From this tiny little sect in the Roman Empire to the powerful global institution that it is today by the time we get to the Reformation.
And what's so cool about this deep dive is we're really going to unearth the how and the why.
It's not just names and dates.
Exactly.
Like, what were those pivotal moments?
Absolutely.
What were the challenges? And how do those things still resonate today?
Yeah, some of those challenges.
I don't know. It's going to be good. I can already feel my brain tingling with anticipation. Okay, so let's set the stage. First, we need to understand the Roman Empire. What was it like back then?
Well, think of it like this, the Roman Empire, this massive interconnected network.
Kind of like the internet.
Almost like the internet of the ancient world.
Okay, I like that.
And because of the Pax Romana, it had all this unity, and it was really peaceful, which was perfect for spreading ideas.
That makes sense.
And everybody used Greek.
Oh, so communication was easy.
Communication was a breeze.
Okay, so new ideas could just like zip around the empire.
Exactly.
But the Roman Empire wasn't all sunshine and roses, was it? I mean, it wasn't exactly known for being, full of saints and angels.
You're right. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of materialism.
So kind of a mixed bag then.
Yeah, but here's the thing.
Okay.
The way that Rome governed,
it
actually helped Christianity spread.
What do you mean?
They allowed all these local institutions to kind of do their thing.
Right.
So these small Christian communities could operate under the radar, at least for a while.
And this is going to be important later on.
This is going to be huge later.
Oh, okay. So maybe the Roman Empire unintentionally helped Christianity to grow.
Yeah, maybe so.
But, Christianity wasn't the only new kid on the block, right?
Right.
What other philosophies were going around at the time?
It's kind of like a bustling marketplace. Yeah. Full of different philosophical stalls. And they're all saying, hey, come check out our wisdom.
I love that analogy.
Right.
So what were some of these stalls selling?
Well, you've got Platonism.
Okay.
They said the perfect versions of things like beauty or justice, they exist, but they exist beyond our world.
So they were like reaching for something beyond. I get that.
They were trying to go beyond the everyday chaos of life,
Okay. What else? What other philosophies?
And then you had Epicureanism, all about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain.
Success.
It wasn't just about indulging, though. It was more about finding balance and tranquility.
I could see how that would be appealing.
And then there was Stoicism. They were all about using reason to live a virtuous life. And a key idea for them was this concept of logos, a divine reason woven into the universe.
Logos. Wait a minute. Isn't that connected to Christianity somehow?
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Okay, I can't wait.
Right.
But first, what about Judaism? I mean, that was the foundation Christianity was built on, right?
Oh, absolutely. But Judaism itself, it was very diverse back then.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you had the Pharisees. They were all about following the law to the letter.
Sticklers for the rules.
Right. And then you had the Sadducees. They were more politically minded.
Oh, so they were playing the game a little bit.
And then you had the Essenes. They were seeking purity, kind of separating themselves from the world.
So lots of different ways of being Jewish.
A real tapestry of beliefs and practices.
Fascinating. Now, there's this idea of wisdom in later Judaism.
Right.
Like it was almost a being alongside God. What's the significance of that?
That's a great question. You see, that idea of wisdom really becomes important when we start talking about Christian views of Jesus.
Ah, okay. I see where you're going with this.
Because Jesus, he was a Jewish teacher, steeped in Jewish thought. Even though, of course, he introduced some radical new ideas.
Right. Okay. So we've got this world of different philosophies, and even within Judaism, there were different interpretations.
Right.
And then along comes Jesus. So what was his core message?
Well, his teaching centered on the kingdom of God, love, forgiveness, and radical inclusion. He really challenged the status quo.
So he wasn't afraid to shake things up a bit.
Not at all. He called out the hypocrisy of the religious elite, and he emphasized compassion above rigid adherence to the law.
It sounds like he turned things upside down.
In a lot of ways, he did.
Now, wasn't Jesus' claim to be the Messiah a major turning point?
Oh, absolutely. Remember, the Jewish people were expecting a Messiah who would liberate them from Roman rule.
A political liberator.
Exactly. But Jesus' idea of liberation, it was different. It was spiritual, a kingdom not of this world.
That is a huge difference. No wonder his message was so controversial. So after Jesus' death, how did his followers carry on his message? Did they all agree on what to do?
Not exactly. One of the biggest challenges the early church faced was, should Christianity stay a sect within Judaism?
Or should it become something bigger?
Exactly. A universal faith, open to everyone. And this question led to a clash between two giants of early Christianity, Peter and Paul.
Wait, Peter and Paul? They didn't see eye to eye. Those are two of the biggest names.
I know, but they had very different views.
So what was the bone of contention? What were they arguing about?
Well, Peter initially, he thought Christianity should stay rooted in Jewish law.
Okay, so he wanted to keep it within those traditions.
Yeah, but Paul, he had this vision of a more inclusive faith.
So he wanted to open it up.
Yeah, he argued that Gentile converts, they didn't need to follow Jewish customs like circumcision.
Wow. Okay, so a pretty big disagreement. What happened? How did they resolve this?
It led to the Jerusalem Council. Basically, all the early church leaders got together to try and hammer out a compromise.
Wow, so a pivotal moment for the early church. What was the outcome? What did they decide?
They decided that Gentile converts didn't have to follow all the Jewish laws.
So they sided with Paul.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah.
And this decision, it paved the way for Christianity to break free from its Jewish roots and become this universal faith. It was a radical decision. It really shaped the trajectory of Christianity.
It's amazing to think about how different things might have been, but we have to remember that, this is still a very young, evolving faith. What was the church structure like back then?
Well, at first it was very spirit-led.
Yeah.
A big emphasis on charismatic gifts like prophecy and healing.
So a very different feel from the institutional church we know today.
Right. But as it grew, it needed more organization, and this led to a shift toward a more structured hierarchy, with bishops, presbyters, and deacons emerging as leaders.
So they were trying to create order out of the chaos of this growing movement.
Right.
Was this structure inspired by the Roman Empire itself?
It's interesting that you say that. There are definitely some parallels.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, think about it. The Roman Empire, with its clear lines of authority, it provided a model.
It was a familiar structure.
Yeah, and it was practical for a church that was becoming so complex and widespread.
Makes sense. So even in its structure, we see Christianity adapting to its context.
Absolutely.
But I'm guessing this shift toward a more structured church wasn't without its challenges.
Oh, you're right about that. And one major challenge came from within: Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. Okay, now we're getting into some interesting territory.
Right, they blended Christian ideas with all sorts of mystical and philosophical elements.
So kind of a different flavor of Christianity.
Yeah, it was a real threat to what was becoming Orthodox Christianity.
Gnosticism versus orthodoxy. Okay, I'm intrigued. What exactly did Gnostics believe?
It was a complex movement, but one of their core beliefs was gnosis, meaning secret knowledge.
So they believed that salvation came through acquiring this secret knowledge.
Exactly, and they often saw this knowledge as superior to faith.
Wow, so a very different approach. And what about Jesus? Do they have different views on him too?
Yeah, some Gnostics believe that Jesus was a divine being who only appeared human.
So they denied his humanity.
In a sense, yes.
So this Gnostic movement, it was pretty radical. What happened to them?
Church leaders, like Irenaeus, they fiercely defended what they saw as Orthodox Christianity.
So they clamped down on the Gnostics.
They saw them as a real threat. Irenaeus emphasized faith in Jesus Christ as the path to salvation, and ultimately the church rejected Gnostic ideas as incompatible with the Gospels.
It sounds like these early church leaders were really shaping the very foundations of Christian belief. Our source mentions some key figures from this period: Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement, Origen. Can you give us a quick rundown of who these figures were and what they contributed?
Think of them as the architects and defenders of early Christian thought. Justin Martyr, for example, he was a philosopher turned Christian. He defended the faith against Roman persecution and tried to build bridges between Christianity and Greek philosophy.
So he was trying to make Christianity intellectually respectable.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's Irenaeus, who we've already talked about. He was a staunch opponent of Gnosticism and a champion of the church's authority.
So making sure everyone stayed on the same page, doctrinally speaking.
Right. And Tertullian, he was a brilliant writer, though a bit sharp-tongued. But he defended traditional Christian beliefs with great passion.
It sounds like they needed someone like that, someone who could argue their case effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's Clement and Origen, both from Alexandria. They were very influential thinkers who integrated Christian faith with Greek philosophy and learning.
So they were bringing together the best of both worlds.
In a lot of ways, yes. They saw no conflict between faith and reason.
So we're seeing these brilliant minds wrestling with complex ideas, shaping the church's understanding of itself and its beliefs. But what about Christian doctrine itself? Was everything set in stone from the beginning? Or were these beliefs still evolving?
Well, early Christianity was a pretty diverse mix of interpretations and beliefs.
Okay, so not everyone agreed on everything.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But as the church faced challenges, core doctrines started to solidify.
So they were hammering things out, figuring out what they really believed.
Exactly. For example, the doctrine of the Trinity, which says that God is one, but exists in three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That emerged through a lot of debate and reflection.
It's a mind-boggling concept, to be honest.
Yeah, it's not easy to wrap your head around.
And there were also debates about Jesus' nature.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. How could he be both fully divine and fully human?
It's still a question that people wrestle with today. So the early church is grappling with these profound theological mysteries, and then, bam, a major plot twist. The Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. I have a feeling this changed everything.
You're absolutely right. Constantine's conversion was a total game changer. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD granted tolerance to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire.
So no more persecution.
Right. It officially ended centuries of persecution.
Wow, what a moment. But, becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, that must have had some downsides too, right? I mean, did it create new problems for Christianity?
That's a really insightful question. It definitely had its complexities. The church became deeply intertwined with the state.
Okay, so the lines got a little blurry.
Yeah. And this relationship, it's had consequences throughout history up to this very day.
So even with an official church, the debates didn't stop, did they?
Oh, not at all. Some people even argue they got even more heated.
So becoming the favored religion didn't magically solve all of Christianity's problems. What were some of the major controversies that rocked the church during this time?
One of the biggest was Arianism. Arius, he was a priest from Alexandria. He taught that Jesus was created by God.
Oh, okay.
And therefore not fully divine.
So a challenge to the very heart of Christian belief.
Absolutely. It divided the church and sparked some really intense debates. To try and settle it, Constantine called for the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD.
The Council of Nicaea. That's a name that echoes through history. Can you give us a refresher on its significance?
This council, it was a defining moment. The bishops, they got together, debated for weeks, and in the end, they condemned Arianism.
So they affirm that Jesus is fully divine.
Exactly, of the same substance as God the Father. And this decision, it laid the foundation for the Nicene Creed.
Which is still a cornerstone of Christian orthodoxy today.
Exactly.
So they are fighting for the very soul of Christianity, trying to figure out what they really believed about Jesus. But even with Arianism settled, I'm guessing the debates didn't stop there, right?
Oh, you know it. They kept going, especially about Christ's nature. How could he be both fully divine and fully human? These questions led to even more councils. Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon.
Okay, I'm getting a little lost in all these councils. Why were they so important?
Think of them like arenas, right? The best theological minds of the day were going head-to-head, trying to define Christian beliefs.
Wrestling with the big questions.
Exactly. They might seem like dry, technical arguments.
I mean, yeah, from our perspective.
But they were really grappling with the heart of the Christian faith. And their decisions have shaped Christian doctrine ever since.
So we've got all this theological debate going on. But did anyone try a different approach? Like, did anyone step outside this whole system?
Yes. And that brings us to the rise of monasticism.
Monasticism. Okay, now we're talking about something completely different.
Right. While all these bishops and theologians were debating doctrine, there were these Christians who wanted a more radical expression of their faith.
So what were they doing?
They formed communities, often in remote locations, dedicated to prayer, solitude, and service.
They were like the countercultural movement within Christianity.
Yeah. In a way, they wanted a different path to God, a path focused on personal transformation and separation from the world.
So monasticism was a way of rejecting the worldliness of the church.
In a way, yes, but it also played a vital role in preserving knowledge and spreading Christianity to new areas.
So they were more than just hermits hiding away in the desert.
Right. And here's a fascinating connection. The rise of monasticism happened alongside the growing veneration of the Virgin Mary.
Wait, Mary, Jesus' mother. What does she have to do with monks?
It's interesting, right? As monasticism emphasized things like purity and asceticism, Mary became a symbol of those values.
So she was seen as the ideal model for monastic life.
In a way, yes. She represented devotion and intercession, and her role in Christian piety grew significantly during this period.
So we're seeing how various expressions of Christian faith were developing side by side. Some were seeking solitude and prayer, while others were engaged in theological debates and building church structures. But what about the mainstream church? Did it just become a tool of the Roman Empire?
That's a great question. While the church and state were definitely intertwined, Christianity continued to develop intellectually and institutionally throughout the Middle Ages. We see major thinkers like Augustine emerge, whose theological writings had a massive impact on Western Christianity.
Augustine. I've definitely heard that name before. But to be honest, I need a refresher on what made him so influential.
Well, Augustine was a theological giant. He wrote about some really profound stuff. God, sin, grace, the human condition, you name it.
So he was wrestling with the big questions.
Yeah, and his ideas had a lasting impact on Christian thought, even up to this day.
So alongside these theological developments, what other figures shaped the course of the church during this period?
Well, there's Gregory the Great, a powerful pope who strengthened papal authority and expanded the church's influence. And then there's Charlemagne, the Frankish king, who revived learning and built a vast empire, which further cemented the church's role in medieval society.
So we're seeing the church's power and influence growing.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the rise of universities and scholasticism.
Hold on, universities in the Middle Ages. Tell me more.
Yeah, it might seem surprising, but the Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. The church was a major force in intellectual life.
So they weren't just copying old manuscripts, they were pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Exactly. The rise of universities and scholasticism, which was this philosophical and theological system that emphasized reason and logic, it shows that Christianity was more than just a religious force. It was an intellectual powerhouse.
So the church is flexing its intellectual muscles during this period. But what about the papacy? Didn't it also become quite powerful during the Middle Ages?
Oh, absolutely. The papacy's power grew significantly during the Middle Ages, not just spiritually, but politically too.
Okay, so the Pope was more than just a spiritual leader.
Yeah, he was a major player in European politics. Think about events like the investiture controversy, where popes clashed with emperors over who had the right to appoint bishops. It was a power struggle between church and state.
So, a battle for supremacy.
Exactly. And the papacy was fighting hard to assert its independence.
So they were standing up to the emperors.
Absolutely. And then there were the Crusades, where popes called for military expeditions to reclaim the Holy Land.
So they could mobilize entire armies.
Right. They could unite European forces under the banner of the church. Figures like Pope Gregory VII, also known as Hildebrand, were really important in reshaping the papacy and expanding its influence.
It sounds like the papacy was on a roll. But even at the height of its power, did it face any challenges? Did cracks start to appear in this seemingly impenetrable facade?
You know, even the most powerful institutions face challenges, and even at the peak of its power, the papacy encountered events that weakened its authority.
So what were some of those challenges? What events started to chip away at the papacy's seemingly unassailable power?
Well, one major challenge was the Babylonian captivity.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
That was in the 14th century.
Okay.
And the papacy was moved to Avignon, France.
To France.
Yeah.
And that put the Pope under the influence of the French monarchy.
So not a good look for the papacy, I imagine.
No, it really weakened their image of independence and authority. It's like, you're supposed to be this universal leader, but then you're kind of in the pocket of the French king.
Right, exactly.
Were there any other events that contributed to this decline?
Yeah, there was another blow.
Okay.
It came with the Great Schism.
The Great Schism.
And this was in the late 14th, early 15th centuries.
Right.
And there were actually rival popes.
Multiple popes.
Yeah, each one claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter.
Oh, wow. That must have been confusing.
Imagine the chaos.
Talk about a leadership crisis.
It really undermined the church's authority.
Yeah, if you've got multiple people claiming to be the top dog, it's not a good situation.
Right, and this contributed to a growing sense of discontent within the church.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
What else was going on?
Well, there was also the rise of national monarchies.
Oh, so political changes were happening too.
Yeah, powerful kings were consolidating their power, and they were challenging the Pope's authority.
So basically they were saying, we're in charge here, not the Pope.
Yeah, they were asserting their own national interests over, papal claims of supremacy.
So the papacy was facing challenges from all sides, basically.
From within and without.
Okay. So we can see how the seeds of discontent were sown long before the Reformation. But were there any individuals who actually spoke out against the church before Martin Luther came along?
There were a few brave souls who dared to criticize the church.
Really?
Yeah, they saw corruption. They called for reform.
Wow, so they were like the precursors to the Reformation.
Yeah, you could say that.
Who are these people?
Figures like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus.
Okay, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. I don't know those names. Tell me about them.
All right. John Wycliffe was an English theologian.
Okay.
And he was really troubled by what he saw happening in the church.
What was he troubled by?
He thought they were straying from their spiritual mission.
Okay.
He criticized their wealth, their involvement in politics, their emphasis on rituals.
So he was like, hey, you guys are supposed to be about something else. You're supposed to be about faith and spirituality, not about power and money.
Exactly. He was calling for a return to genuine piety.
And what about Jan Hus? What were his main beefs?
Jan Hus, he was a Bohemian priest.
Okay.
He echoed a lot of Wycliffe's criticism.
Well, they were on the same page, basically.
Yeah, he denounced the church's moral laxity, called for reforms in church practices, and he also championed translating the Bible into the vernacular languages.
Oh, wow. So that ordinary people could read it.
Exactly. He wanted people to be able to understand the scriptures for themselves.
That's pretty radical for that time. What happened to these guys?
Well, they were both condemned by the church.
So they weren't popular with the powers that be?
No. Wycliffe's writings were banned, and Hus was burned at the stake as a heretic.
Wow, so they paid the ultimate price for their beliefs.
They did. But even though they were silenced, their ideas had a lasting impact.
It's amazing how these seeds of dissent can take root and grow into something so powerful.
Yeah, it really is. And their ideas, they inspired others who also longed for change within the church.
So they paved the way for the Reformation.
In many ways, they did.
This brings us to the eve of the Reformation. What was happening in Europe that made it ripe for such a dramatic upheaval?
Well, there are all sorts of changes happening.
Okay, like what?
For one, the invention of the printing press.
Oh, yeah, Gutenberg.
Exactly. It meant that ideas could spread much faster.
So it wasn't just the church controlling information anymore.
Right, exactly.
So kind of like the social media of its day.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Okay. Were there any other factors at play?
Yeah, there was also the Renaissance spirit.
Oh, yeah, the Renaissance. A time of great change and upheaval.
Exactly. People were questioning authority, rediscovering classical learning. They weren't afraid to challenge the status quo.
So this new spirit of inquiry and questioning, it was bound to impact the church too.
It was only a matter of time.
Were there any specific issues within the church that were fueling this discontent?
Oh, yeah. There was growing discontent with certain practices.
Like what?
Well, the sale of indulgences was a big one.
Indulgences.
Yeah. A lot of people saw it as a way for the church to profit from people's fear of damnation.
Okay, so not exactly a spiritually pure practice.
No, it seemed pretty corrupt to many people.
So we've got all these factors converging, the printing press, the Renaissance, discontent within the church. It sounds like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah, you could say that. The stage was definitely set for a major showdown.
And into this volatile mix steps Martin Luther.
Martin Luther, the rebel monk.
A man who changed the course of history.
Indeed.
So tell me, what was it about Luther that made him such a catalyst for change?
Well, Luther was a complex figure. He was brilliant, a deep thinker.
Okay.
And he struggled with the big questions.
Sin, grace, salvation.
With all of that, he felt this deep sense of unworthiness. But through this struggle, he rediscovered the power of the gospel.
So it was his personal experience that led to his theological insights.
Yeah, I think you could say that. He came to believe that salvation comes through faith alone.
Faith in Jesus Christ.
Exactly. Not through works or rituals.
And that was a direct challenge to the church's teachings.
It was.
Okay, so this is where the famous 95 Theses come in.
The lightning bolt that ignited the Reformation.
What was Luther actually protesting when he nailed those theses to the church door?
Well, he was sparked by the sale of indulgences.
Right. He saw that as a distortion of the gospel.
Exactly. He thought it was exploiting people's fear and guilt.
It's like, pay us money and we'll guarantee you a spot in heaven.
Yeah, it was a pretty audacious scheme.
So how did the church react to Luther's challenge?
At first, they underestimated him.
They didn't see him as a serious threat.
No, they thought he was just another rebellious monk. They tried to silence him, but his ideas spread too quickly.
Thanks to the printing press.
Exactly. It was like trying to put out a wildfire.
So the more they tried to suppress Luther, the more his ideas spread.
Yeah, it's often the way with these things.
So Luther refuses to back down. What happens next?
He was summoned before the emperor.
Oh, wow. So is it getting serious?
At the Diet of Worms.
The Diet of Worms.
Yeah, it was in 1521.
Okay. What happened there?
Well, they ordered him to recant.
To take back his teachings.
Yeah, but he refused.
Wow. He stood his ground?
He said his conscience was captive to the word of God.
So he couldn't go against what he believed.
Right. He said, "Here I stand. I can do no other."
What a powerful moment. So Luther's movement is gaining momentum. His ideas are spreading. He's openly defying the church. What happens to this movement? Does it stay unified?
Sadly, no. As the Reformation gained momentum, it also started to fragment.
Okay. How so?
Well, other reformers like Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland and John Calvin in Geneva, they developed their own interpretations of key doctrines.
So even though they agreed on the need for reform, they disagreed on what that reform should look like.
Right.
What were some of the key issues that divided them?
Well, one of the biggest debates was about the Lord's Supper, communion.
Okay. Luther, he believed in the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine.
So he thought it was more than just a symbolic act.
Right. But Zwingli, he saw it as a memorial meal, just a symbolic remembrance.
So a very different understanding of that central ritual.
Yeah. And Calvin, he took a kind of middle ground.
Okay.
He affirmed Christ's spiritual presence.
So even a ritual essential as communion became a point of division.
It did.
Were there other issues that caused these splits?
They also argued about things like predestination, the role of the church, the relationship between church and state.
It sounds like a lot of theological hair splitting.
Well, yeah, some of it might seem like that to us today, but these were really important issues to them. And these differences led to the emergence of distinct Protestant denominations.
So we've got Lutherans, Zwinglians, Calvinists, and others, each with their own spin on the faith.
Right.
It's fascinating how this one movement splintered into so many different branches. How did the Catholic Church respond to all this? Well, at first, they kind of struggled to grasp what was happening.
They didn't see it coming.
No, they didn't. They tried to counter the Reformation with internal reforms.
So they tried to reform themselves.
Yeah, and they also tried to crack down on dissent.
So a two-pronged approach, reform and repress.
Exactly.
What were some of the internal reforms they made?
Well, one of the key events was the Council of Trent.
Okay.
It met on and off for about 20 years, starting in 1545.
Okay, so they were really taking their time with this.
Yeah, they were trying to address some of the abuses that had fueled the Reformation.
Like the sale of indulgences.
Right, and the laxity of the clergy.
So they were trying to clean up their act.
Yeah, and they also emphasized education and discipline for priests.
Okay, so a return to the basics of the faith. Do you think these reforms were genuine, or were they just a reaction to the threat of Protestantism?
That's a good question. It was probably a bit of both. But, regardless of their motivations, the Catholic Church went through some major changes.
So the Reformation had a lasting impact, even on the church it was trying to reform.
Absolutely.
What about their efforts to suppress dissent?
Well, they revived the Inquisition.
Oh, wow, the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Not exactly known for their tolerance.
Right. They were trying to root out heresy, and they also supported the Jesuits.
Jesuits, okay.
Yeah, a new religious order.
What were they all about?
Well, they focused on education, missionary work, and combating the spread of Protestant ideas.
So they were the church's shock troops, in a way.
Yeah, you can think of them that way.
So the Counter-Reformation was a mixed bag.
Yeah, reform and repression.
What was the overall impact of the Reformation on Europe?
Well, sadly, it led to a lot of conflict.
Wars.
Yeah, wars, persecutions.
So it wasn't exactly a peaceful time.
No, it wasn't. But eventually, a new understanding of religious coexistence began to emerge.
So out of all that conflict, some good came.
Well, the Reformation ultimately led to greater religious freedom and pluralism. It also fostered the development of national identities.
Okay, so it wasn't just about religion. It was about politics and culture, too.
Exactly.
What about its impact on intellectual and cultural life?
Well, it spurred a lot of creativity. New ideas, new interpretations. It inspired art, music, literature.
So a time of great ferment.
It was. And it led to new educational institutions.
Wow, so a lot of positive things came out of it, too.
Yeah. Alongside the conflict, there was also a lot of creativity and progress.
Let's take a closer look at John Calvin.
Calvin, yeah. He's a fascinating figure.
I've always heard he was a bit of a hardliner.
He emphasized moral conduct and strict adherence to the Bible.
Okay, so he was pretty serious about his faith.
Yeah.
Was Geneva, where he established his church, really as strict and austere as some people claim?
Well, there was definitely an emphasis on discipline, but Calvin's impact goes far beyond rules and regulations. His theology was very influential.
And his big idea was predestination, right?
Yeah, predestination was a core part of his theology, the idea that God has chosen certain people for salvation before they're even born.
Okay, that's a tough one to wrap your head around. So Calvin believed that we have no choice in the matter of our salvation.
Well, he affirmed both God's sovereignty and human responsibility. It's a complex theological issue.
So even today, people are still debating what Calvin really meant.
Yeah, exactly.
Calvin's ideas spread pretty far, didn't they?
They did. Calvinism became a major force in the Reformation. France, Scotland, the Netherlands, England, even parts of the New World.
Wow, so it was a global phenomenon.
Absolutely. And his followers, the Huguenots in France, the Puritans in England, they played significant roles in their respective countries.
What was so appealing about Calvinism? Why did it catch on in so many places?
Well, it emphasized education, hard work, thrift, social responsibility.
Okay, so a pretty demanding faith.
Yeah. But those values resonated with a lot of people, especially those who were trying to reform both church and state. It was more than just a set of beliefs. It was a way of life.
A blueprint for a godly society.
You could say that.
What about its impact on Western thought and culture in general? Did it contribute to things like democracy and capitalism?
That's a big question that scholars are still debating. Some argue that Calvinism, with its emphasis on individual conscience, helped to lay the groundwork for modern democratic ideas. Others see its emphasis on hard work and thrift as contributing to the development of capitalism.
So it had ripple effects far beyond the realm of religion.
Yeah, its influence is still felt today in many different areas of life.
Okay, so we've talked about Luther, we talked about Calvin. Now let's go back to the Catholic Church on the Counter-Reformation. What were they doing to try and win back those who had left the church? Was it all about cracking down on dissent?
No, it wasn't just about repression.
Okay.
They were also trying to reform themselves. Remember the Council of Trent?
Right, where they addressed some of the abuses.
Exactly. They wanted to show that they were serious about spiritual renewal.
So they weren't just trying to stamp out Protestantism.
No, they were also trying to make the Catholic Church a more vibrant and faithful institution.
Okay, so they were trying to offer a genuine alternative.
Yeah. They wanted to demonstrate the richness and beauty of the Catholic tradition.
So we have these two reform movements, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, both happening at the same time.
It was a period of great upheaval and change.
What was the long-term impact of all this religious turmoil? Did Europe just descend into endless religious wars?
Well, there were definitely more conflicts, but eventually it led to a more pluralistic religious landscape.
So how did that happen? How did we go from religious wars to religious pluralism?
It was a long and often painful process, marked by wars and persecutions, but a new understanding of religious coexistence did start to emerge.
Okay.
The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, it finally ended the 30 Years' War.
Oh, wow.
And that was a pivotal moment. It recognized the right of princes to determine the religion of their own territories. So it laid the groundwork for, religious coexistence, at least within those boundaries.
So not perfect, but a step in the right direction.
A step towards acknowledging the reality of religious diversity. Yeah.
Did this idea of religious tolerance continue to evolve?
Yes. And the separation of church and state, too. They gradually gain ground. And then the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment, yeah.
With all its emphasis on reason and individual liberty.
Right.
That further challenged traditional notions of religious authority.
So we're entering a new era. Reason and science are challenging long-held beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
How did this emphasis on reason impact Christianity?
Well, it definitely posed a major challenge. Thinkers like John Locke, David Hume.
Big names.
Yeah. They questioned the authority of Scripture.
They said reason, not revelation,
Yeah.
is the ultimate source of knowledge.
Exactly.
So it was a time when people were, testing everything.
Yeah.
Demanding evidence.
Exactly.
Which is, a good thing.
Yeah.
But how did Christians respond to this challenge?
There were a lot of different responses. Some people embraced deism.
Deism, okay.
Which is the belief in a God who created the world but doesn't really intervene.
So like a watchmaker god.
Yeah.
Creates the universe and then steps back.
Exactly.
Okay. Were there other attempts to reconcile faith and reason?
Oh, yeah. A lot of Christian thinkers were trying to find that common ground, like Immanuel Kant. He argued that religion and morality are grounded in our sense of duty, our rational understanding of right and wrong.
So faith and reason aren't necessarily opposed to each other.
Right.
They can coexist.
Exactly.
Were there any other responses to this challenge from the Enlightenment?
Well, alongside those intellectual debates, there was another development, pietism.
Pietism.
Yeah. It emphasized personal experience of God.
Okay.
A heartfelt emotional faith. And it focused on living a devout life, doing acts of charity.
So less about doctrine and more about practice.
Yeah, more about how you lived your faith.
What was the impact of pietism?
It was huge, especially in Germany and England.
Okay.
And it led to the formation of new denominations, like the Methodists.
Oh, wow, the Methodists. So it had a lasting impact.
And it really inspired this renewed focus on social activism within Christianity.
So Christianity was changing and adapting to the times?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just retreating in the face of these challenges. What about all the political upheavals of this era? I mean, did revolutions and wars have an impact on the church?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, like what?
The French Revolution, with its anti-clericalism and its focus on secularism, it had a huge impact. Churches were closed, priests were persecuted.
It sounds like a very difficult time for the church.
It was. But the church, it's remarkably resilient.
Okay.
It found ways to adapt to this new, more secular society.
By focusing on its spiritual mission.
Yeah. And by doing a lot of charitable work.
So even in times of persecution, the church finds a way to survive and even thrive.
Yeah.
By staying true to its core values. What about the Napoleonic Wars?
Those wars, they redrew the map of Europe. They led to the decline of the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of new nation-states.
And the papacy.
It further weakened the papacy's political power.
So the church's influence continued to decline.
In some ways, yes. But it was also a time of renewal and new beginnings. We see the rise of revivalism, especially in America.
Revivalism, okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, they really emphasized personal conversion and emotional experience. These revivals were like spiritual awakenings, and they swept through communities.
It sounds very different from the dry intellectualism of the Enlightenment.
It was. It was all about a heartfelt, passionate faith.
And this appealed to a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, huge crowds. People were looking for meaning and purpose, and these revivals offered a sense of hope and connection.
It sounds like they were tapping into a deep human need. What was the impact of these revivals in the long term?
It was huge. They led to new denominations like the Baptists and the Methodists, and they inspired a lot of social reform movements like abolitionism. So they were about more than just individual piety.
Right. They were about changing society.
Exactly.
What other important developments were happening within Christianity at this time?
Well, another key development was the rise of Protestant missions.
Missions?
Yeah, people like William Carey were really influential.
Okay.
They sent missionaries all over the world, Asia, Africa, the Pacific.
Wow. So Christianity was becoming a truly global faith.
It was.
What kind of impact did these missionaries have?
Well, they faced a lot of challenges, language barriers, cultural differences, resistance from local people.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But they also made some important contributions in education, healthcare, social reform.
Okay.
So it's a complex legacy.
A mix of good and bad.
Yeah.
How did this encounter with other cultures change Christianity?
Well, it forced Christians to rethink some of their assumptions.
Yeah.
And it led to a lot of new translations of the Bible, indigenous Christian movements.
It broadened their horizons.
It did. Made them more aware of the diversity of human experience. And that's a process that's still ongoing today.
It's been an amazing journey. We've covered so much ground, from the early church all the way to the modern world.
Yeah, it's quite a story.
What are some key things you think our listeners should take away from all this?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that Christianity has never stood still.
It's always evolving.
Yeah. It's always been shaped by history, by culture, by the human search for meaning. It's a story of both continuity and change.
We've seen how Christianity has faced so many challenges: persecutions, heresies, schisms, revolutions, scientific discoveries, secularism. But it's always found a way to adapt and survive.
Yeah, it's incredibly resilient.
And what do you think the future holds for Christianity?
That's a great question. How will it respond to the challenges of the 21st century?
Climate change, poverty, injustice.
All of that. And how will it engage with science and technology? Will it find ways to bridge divides and build unity in a world that's often so fragmented? Only time will tell.
It's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds.
It really is.
Well, thanks for joining us on this incredible journey through the history of Christianity.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating and complex faith.
Yeah, there's always more to discover.
So, how did we do? Let us know what you thought of the conversation. Did they represent Walker well? Did Walker represent Christian history well? Stay tuned later today for a discussion on Augustine's City of God. Every week in January, we'll be discussing a different book by Augustine and see what connections he makes and see if we agree.